of books sandwiched in. And today, Dr. Gary Emerson will be reviewing the book, The Raging Erie, Life and Labor Along the Erie Canal by Mark Ferrara. This is the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal. Our book examines the canal's beneficial and not so beneficial impact on the people who worked on it. Dr. Emerson taught American history at Newfield Central School near Ithaca, New York for 36 years before retiring in 2013. He received a BA in history from St. Bonaventure University and an MA in history from Binghamton University. He completed his PhD at Binghamton University in American history in May 2024. So without further delay, Dr. Gary Emerson.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. I ran across this book when I actually was given a talk at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. They invited me there to talk about the Schmung Canal, which was a local canal that you're probably familiar with. And so of course I had to go into a bookstore, and I found this book and I thought it looked interesting, so I figured I'd get a copy of it and read it, and I kind of liked it. I do book reading and discussion groups for libraries, and I was doing one in Newfield where I used to teach, and this is one of the books we read and talked about. So I'm glad to come here today and talk about it. And, so here's the author, Mark Ferrara. He teaches at SUNY Oneonta, and he's authored 7 books. This is his most recent work that he's done. And these are some other books about the Erie Canal. They're got kind of some significant attention. The Artificial River by Carol Sheriff, and What Into the Waters by Peter Bernstein. And then we got Bonded Union by Gerard Copel. So these books mostly talk and celebrate the Erie Canal for the contributions to the growth of cities and population and the jobs they created and the wealth they created. This book does not do that. This book is a little different book. It takes a look at it from a different angle. And so he says right in his book on page 3 that I propose instead a journey through canal life from the perspective of the ordinary folks who experience firsthand the dislocating and alienating social consequences, the extreme class and income inequity, inequality that this waterway wrought. So he's looking at this from the perspective of the ordinary people who worked on the canal and how it impacted them. In a lot of ways, it did not impact them very well. This table of contents indicates that the pages of the book are going to reveal stories about murders, fights, child labor, poverty, all the social ills, accidents, and social dislocation that happened because of the Erie Canal, which is not the usual story you get in a book about the Erie Canal. One group of people that certainly did not benefit from the Erie Canal were the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee. They once owned much of New York State, and after the American Revolution, white settlers began pouring into their lands and forcing them into treaties where they lost a lot of their land. And the people wanted this land because they wanted to build a transportation network, and that would become the Erie Canal. And one of the chief architects of dispossessing the Native Americans of their land so they could build the Erie Canal was a guy named Philip Schuyler, who Schuyler County, my county where I'm from, and the county historian for Schuyler County, is named after Philip Schuyler, even though he never set foot in the county. But he helped have all these treaties that take the land away from the Iroquois Indians so the Erie Canal could get built. So the Haudenosaunee were pushed onto reservations so the Erie Canal could come into being. And so this shows all the different land purchases that happened, and settlers start pouring into these lands, even around this area as well. And they were forced onto small reservations. Life on those reservations was not the greatest in the world. There's a little monument on Route 33 in Cooperstown, New York. There's this mound. It actually is a burial mound. There are a number of Native Americans buried in that mound. And there's a a stone marker on it that has this greeting. It says, "White man greeting, we near whose bones you stand, where Iroquois, the wide land which is now yours, was ours. Friendly hands have given back to us enough for a tomb." So it indicates that the Native Americans basically got their land stolen from them, and all they got left was this mound. A book that he relies on in writing his chapter about the Iroquois dispossession is this one, Conspiracy of Interest, by Lawrence Hauptman. And this is a book I've read with one of my reading groups as well before. It talks about how the Iroquois lost their land in all these treaty negotiations. And by hook and by crook, they eventually were forced on these reservations. And the whole point of the book is that it was all done so they could create this transportation network of not just canals, but also railroads eventually as well. This picture shows hoagies on the towpath. When the canal was built, they employed a lot of children working on the canals. They were called wharf rats and powder monkeys. One of the jobs that children had when they were building the canal is help bring the gunpowder they used to blow stumps up and blast rock away. And it was the kids who had the job of lighting the fuse for those explosions. So you had to light it and run fast, and sometimes kids were injured from doing it. So they left up to children to light the fuse. But many young boys with no skills from poor families, many were orphans, were employed on the canal as hoagies on the towpath with the mules and horses. And they drank and swore just like the adult canal workers. And they often were abused, poorly paid, and rather poorly clothed. So life was pretty tough for them on the canal. He talks about in the book, The Raging Erie, about how they set up orphanages because there were so many orphan children at the time. You know, a lot of adults, a lot of people died young, and a lot of parents died and left their kids orphans. And so it said between 20 and 30% of children became orphans before the age of 15. So what happens to these kids? So eventually the state started establishing orphanages like this one in Buffalo to try and care for these kids. But a lot of them ended up getting jobs, working on the canal, working in factories and things. Of course, the canal also closed every winter. The canal operated usually starting in the first week of May and it closed the first week of December. So if you're a canal worker, you have nothing to do in wintertime. You have no source of income. So it was kind of tough. So many people were living in poverty through the winter, just waiting for the canal to reopen again so they could get back to work again. So you're left out of work for a few months every time the winter showed up and the canal closed. This is a marker that's in a town along the Old Erie Canal. Fighting was a common thing on the canal. Fights often broke out at locks. When you're going through a lock, there were many boats all trying to go through the same lock at once, and they often got in a competition of who's going to go first. And usually it was the boat that had the toughest crew that got to go first. So a brawl would break out. And this is a historic marker that's actually in the town that marks one of the biggest brawls that happened. And actually a guy was killed as a result of this. But one guy got on the other person's boat, and he was trying to move the boats apart, and people on the other boat didn't like that so much, so he hit him across the head with a pole. Oh. And then they got in this big fight, and they started punching and hitting each other and striking each other with stuff, and this one guy got his skull fractured and he ended up dying from it. But that's the kind of stuff that happened all the time on the Erie Canal, or canal fights like this. Even in my studies about the Chemung Canal, I read about fights that happened on locks on the Chemung Canal around here. And boats even hired tough men to work on their boat. If you had a packet boat going through the canal, you had to have a captain of the boat, you had people who run the helm of the boat, you had to have people who were the hoagies and the towpath, but you also hired a guy who was big and tough that could beat people up, because you had to contend for that at some of the locks. Mules were the preferred mode of power on the Erie Canal. They used horses as well, but mules were preferred because mules were pretty hardy animals. They don't eat as much food as horses do. They're healthier than horses. They live longer than horses. A canal mule could be in service for 18 to 20 years. And in 1874, there were 16,000 horses and mules plying the towpath of the Erie Canal. but they're also pretty much abused. These animals were overworked, often underfed, and it was a tough life to be a mule. Some people I read before even said that to curse somebody, they say, hope you come back as a Erie Canal mule, because it was not a very nice life. Luckily, there were some people who were looking out for the mules, and this guy was one of them. This is Henry Berg. He becomes the founder of the ASPCA. He didn't like to see this animal cruelty going on, so he worked for laws to get animals protected. In fact, New York State was the first state that passed an animal anti-cruelty law in 1828. And it was broadened later in 1867, excuse me, under the efforts of Henry Berg. So he even had an ambulance for animals in New York City. It's not just canal mules and horses. It's also, people use horses and mules in cities for carriages and things. And so he got these laws passed to protect these animals, and had something like this to pick up sick animals. And it wasn't uncommon along the Erie Canal to see a dead horse just lying on the towpath, or a dead mule, and that happened all the time, or even floating in the canal. So he did a lot to get this protected. I remember reading an article about a policeman approached a man in New York City, a coach driver. He was beating his horse, and he told him, "You can't do that." The guy was astonished to think that there was a law that told him he couldn't beat his horse. But the police officer told him that that's cruelty to animals, you're not allowed to do it anymore. This is another quote from the book. The annual draining and spring cleaning of the canal exposed bottles and garbage, junk, dead mules, horses, even human bodies were found in the drained canal, and more. But that detritus bears witness to the fact that the prosperity the Erie Canal created for New York State, the nation, was built on the backs of children and animals, as well as that of millions of immigrants who poured into the U.S. during the mid-19th century. So this is a premise he makes in his book. There's a song, I think, that illustrates some of the problems on the Erie Canal that he talks about in the book. So this is going to be, I'm sorry, but this is probably your earworm for the day. I won't be able to get this tune out of your head for a couple of days, but this is boating on a bullhead. A bullhead boat was different because there weren't any real sides to get down. If you're on top of the boat, there's no place to go if you come to a low bridge. There's no place to get to safety. So they're kind of dangerous. So this is boating on a bullhead.
Some hay. Well, the boss was kicking my start around every night and every day. So I hired out Canal, and as a hurry and a toil, trying to get the ball on the best smelling soil. Well, I could raise corns and blisters, and those wheels would raise a stain. I took him to the twisters, up in the dirty drink. I thought I'd give up driving, and the captain thought so too. He said, hire out a diving or go bowing up the new. I'm driving on the heel path, watching boats all up and down. A shivering from the twister bath, I got some I left down. When a boat tied in the basin, and the wood got for the night. Then I lost the turn to hasten round the bridge to last a fight. Now they told me up the beach and showed them lighting me a cob. They asked if I could steer a boat, they offered me a job. The next morning I was boosted to the stern cabin's room. With a tiller there I roosted and I watched the driver move. Now the boat was a bullhead decked up on the cabin's knob. Many canals now are dead, had no place to drop. When the bows and he forgot the yellow bridge took her down. Well, the boat's 6 steersman went to hell with the bridge string for a crown. We were loaded down the starboard, so the captain was loaded too. I wouldn't say it was all his fault, but what's a man to do? The bridge was going to heave away when I saw it round the bend. The captain, a word I didn't say, well, tumbling end for end. So canals take my warning, never steer a bullet boat. Well, I'll find you some fair morning in the Erie afloat. Do all your fine navigating in a line barn filled with hay. In low bridge you won't be hating, and you'll live till Judgment Day.
So some of the lines in the song illustrate some of the hardships and conditions on the canal talks about sleeping in a line barn, and he says, well, the boss was kicking my starn every night and day. So, working on the canal was a tough life, and you often got abused as a worker on the canal. I mean, you might get beat up by somebody all the time. Working on the bullhead boat as a bowsman, he forgot the low bridge stuck her down, and he actually was thinking about getting killed on the boats. Like there was a lot of loss of life on the canal, and it seemed like life was kind of cheap on the canal to some people. I like this line here too. We were loaded down with Star Brand salt. The captain was loaded too. There was a lot of drinking on the canal. People often were riding on their boats and they were intoxicated while they're going along on their boats because there was a lot of whiskey consumed as they're working. So the Erie Canal led to a rise of cities along its way, and with it came the rise of market capitalism, which he points out in the book. So you see this rise of free enterprise and big business, factories getting started in cities, and the canals bringing the things they need to produce goods, and it has a means to ship those goods out and ship them all over the place to a market across the United States. So it really made some people quite wealthy. But work life and home life, which once connected, now becomes separate spheres. It used to be people who worked in their homes, but now you're working in a factory. And the wife stays at home, and her job is to take care of the domestic sphere, take care of the things at home. Men work for these low wages and were dependent on their employer. And you get this, in market capitalism, you get this distributive injustice. Some people make a lot of money, and some people who do important jobs don't make much money at all. Like, anybody have an idea how much Dana White gets paid a year to touch letters on a TV show, Wheel of Fortune? How much?
Millions.
$3 million to touch letters. How about Aaron Judge, the baseball player for the Yankees? How much money he makes every time he comes up to have an at-bat, one at-bat? $70,000. One at-bat. That's distributive injustice. I mean, these people do these things like play baseball and make incredible sums of money, but people like policemen and firemen don't make anywhere near that kind of money. That's distributive injustice, and that's what happens when you see the rise of market capitalism. Immigrant labor also became important for meeting the demands for workers. So many workers in the canal were Irish. When they first started building the canal, I mean, the perception we have is that the canal was dug by the Irish. When they first started, that's not true. They're mostly local farmers who did the work around Rome and Utica. It's only when the canal got further away and out in the sticks that the farmers didn't want to do that work. It was too far away from their farms. So that's when they started bringing in people like the Irish to do the work. And they did the backbreaking work of digging the canal, repairing it. They worked for low wages and lived in very harsh conditions. A lot of Irish did a lot of fighting, and had a reputation for fighting. So some of them actually turned fighting into a way to make money. So fighting was a common practice of the canal. It became a way for Irish immigrants to improve their lives by fighting in professional matches. Like this guy here, Paddy Ryan. He owned a saloon in Watervliet near the canal. He was known for handling any rough patrons with his own fist. The athletic director at RPI nearby decided that, you could maybe be a professional boxer. So he started training him. He became the world champion. One fight he fought in West Virginia against the English champion, his name was Joe Goss, won 87 rounds. This is a bare-knuckle fight, 87 rounds. These guys aren't wearing gloves. It was pretty brutal fighting. 87 rounds, and he won the world championship. They even wrote a song about his victory, Paddy Ryan and Joe Goss. A dozen men once entered his saloon in Watervliet, and they locked the door and they said, "We're going to kick you apart." He knocked the daylights out of all 12 of them. That's how tough this guy was. So canal workers were kind of seen by the rest of the population as immoral. They fought, they swore, they drank to excess. They weren't going to church on Sunday because they're working on the canal all the time. Herman Melville once described canalers as picturesquely wicked. And Ferrara says that the unruly behavior of canal workers provided a lurid example of the moral cost of progress. We have to put up with this because it's just part of progress. That's how he described them as. He also argues that they became, these working class and poor women became marginalized by the rise of this market economy as they worked for these low wages in really harsh conditions. And it led some women to push back against staying in their own domestic sphere. I mean, women didn't like the fact that they were kind of being shoved aside and marginalized and had this domestic sphere that they're expected to stay in. Here's a lady who kind of worked against that. Her name was Anne Royale, and she was left penniless after her husband died. And this is a typical thing. And if your husband died, you're in tough straits because how are you going to get by now? He was the breadwinner in the family, so she had to find some other way to get by. She became a travel writer, which is unusual for a woman in those days. But she was very critical of evangelical religion and criticized their followers as hypocrites. And she also defended free speech. Her writings often were very blunt and critical of places she visited. And she also editorialized in there a little bit and would start talking about the different religious groups and how they were hypocrites. But people began criticizing her for being unwomanly and tried to silence her by taking her to court. Ferrara describes her trial in 1829 as probably the last witch trial. And she was found guilty of being a common scold and a disturber of the peace and got fined $10. A common punishment at that time was for being a common scold was the ducking stool. They put you on the stool, they have a long pole over a pond, and they ducked you under, and they held you for a while, and then they pulled you up, and they put you under again, and that was a common practice. She didn't get that. She was lucky. She was just fined $10. The judge kind of took mercy on her. But she accused the Presbyterian Church of subverting the Constitution and subverting the idea of separation of church and state. And she didn't seem to like a lot of these evangelical religions very much. She wrote this travel book that was called The Black Book. It kind of reminded me of that movie, The Green Book. She had The Black Book, and she talked about places she visited along the canal and other places, and what were good places to stay and what places weren't. But she did a lot of editorializing in her book and complained about these religious groups. We had our own local kind of Anne Royale. Her name was Amanda Mitchell, and she was known as Suckerville Mandy. She lived in Gibson near Corning on the Chemung Canal, and she was seen as being not really in the domestic sphere anymore. She wasn't really staying in her womanly sphere. She was often drunk, and when she was in the jail, she would just start making noise, banging a cup against the bars or whatever, and she wouldn't let anybody else fall asleep. And so she was shipped off to Rochester to the workhouse for 91 days. And she eventually got up. Her offense was she got drunk, she knocked men down. So she often beat up men. And she broke windows, and she was raising all kinds of Cain. Corning newspaper described Mandy as that miserable wreck of womanhood. So she was seen as really not being the ideal woman. And that was her great sin, they thought. One other time, around midnight, a fire bell started ringing, and the people all jumped up in alarm. Oh my gosh, there's a fire! And they all got dressed in a hurry, ran to the firehouse, and there was Mandy inside, ringing the bell, laughing her head off, drunk as a skunk. She thought this was the funniest little joke, and they were all really angry at her. So this is the kind of stuff that she did all the time that was kind of unwomanly. She once went into a church, the Episcopal church, and started making all kinds of noise and yelling stuff out in the middle of the service, and the minister had to take off his robe, grab her, and push her out the door. So she did these kind of things all the time that got her this bad reputation of being unwomanly. Then suddenly, in 1875, she seemed to vanish. Nobody knew where she was. They hadn't seen her in a long time. People were actually a little bit worried, where's Suckerville Mandy? We hadn't seen her in quite a while. And no one seemed to know what had become of her. Well, come to find out, she had drowned. She fell in the race of a dam near Gibson and drowned, and the boy was fishing, and he cast his line in, and he pulled it back in, and it had hair stuck on it. So they said, oh, that doesn't look good. So they drained the water out, and they found her body. And so Suckerville Mandy was drunk, probably fell in and drowned. Or she may have been murdered, we don't know, because she was last seen with a couple men, and then suddenly she was gone. So they don't know if she was murdered by these men or if she fell in an accident and drowned. We don't know what happened to her. But even around here on the Chemung Canal, we had these kind of characters like this, like Anne Royale, women who didn't really fit the mold of being very womanly. He spent some time in the book talking about this murder that happened in 1836, the murder of Helen Jewett. She was a prostitute in New York City. And this other guy, his name was Robinson, they were having an affair, and he was 19, she was 23, I think. And she wanted to marry him. He didn't want to get married. She said that if he didn't marry her, she could ruin him. She put some things in the newspapers about him that would ruin him. So he snuck into the brothel with a long cape, and under it he had an axe. And he murdered her in her bed, and then he set fire to the bed. And so they had this big trial when they caught him about this murder, and as a result, he was acquitted. Because the only witnesses were other prostitutes. The judge would not allow them as witnesses. He told the jury to disregard any of their testimony. So without that, the jury had to acquit him. So it's a real travesty of justice. This goes to show that the injustice towards women at this time, that they weren't considered competent to testify in court, that they couldn't count on their testimony, that they really couldn't be relied upon. Women really had a second or third class kind of citizenship at the time. 4 days after she was buried, medical students dug up Helen Jewett's body and used it for medical science. Her skeleton was stored in the closet for many, many years at this medical school. This happened to people all the time. When a murderer was hanged, he'd get buried, but a few days later, medical students would dig up the body so they could dissect it and learn from it. He talks about how the Erie Canal contributed to the rise of religious revivals. Things were so bad among the canal workers, the drunkenness, the fighting and stuff, that people thought, we got to do something to make our society better. We got to clean this all up. So religious revivals got started. In the Western New York area where we live, became known as the burned over district, from all these religious revivals that were being held. And they would go out in the woods somewhere, and everybody would gather, and they'd live in tents for a few days, and they would have these baptisms and all kinds of sermons and those kind of things. And hopefully they were going to spread religion so that society would clean itself up. Out of this came some new religions as well, like the Millerites. William Miller claimed that he knew the day of the second coming of Christ. He figured it out in the Bible. It was going to be on such and such a day in 1842, I think it was. So the Millerites all, and they show you here, they sold all their possessions and put these white robes on and got on top of their houses or on top of hilltops, and they waited for the second coming to happen. It's coming that day. They waited, and they waited, and they waited, and it didn't come. So then Miller said, well, I made a mistake. My computations were off. It's going to be on this day instead. So they did it again. Still nothing. But the Millerites eventually evolved into the Seventh-day Adventist religion. Also along the canal, you had the formation of the Mormon faith, Joseph Smith. And of course, he eventually began preaching the idea of polygamy, which was very repulsive to a lot of people. And Joseph Smith had to often flee with his followers because people in the communities would not accept his idea of polygamy. And a lady named Ann Lee founded the Shakers. And they show one of the religious ceremonies here. The men and women sat in separate spaces inside the church, and they believed in celibacy. So the only way they could have children was to adopt them. And in those days, there were lots of kids to adopt, as we learned. But the Shaker religion was founded as part of this evangelical religious revival in the 1830s and 40s. Another kind of religion was spiritualism. The Fox sisters of Rochester, a canal town, said that they could communicate with the dead. They lived in a house they said was haunted, and that they could communicate with the dead, and they would hear these rapping noises. And one of the reasons for the rise of spiritualism is this is in the 1840s. You start to see the rise of the use of electricity. The telegraph has been invented, and people thought that maybe there's a way to communicate with the dead. So the Fox sisters claimed that they could talk to the dead. And people sat there, heard this rapping noise, like this, and wow, they're really, talking to the dead. They kept trying to figure out how they were doing it. Maybe they were frauds, but they couldn't prove that they were faking it. What they didn't know is they actually were cracking the joints in their toes. And that was making the rapping sound. So it was years and years and years before they finally admitted that they were frauds. But people thought that this was the real thing. They're talking to the dead. And And it's another thing that came about because of the rise of the Erie Canal. Even Abraham Lincoln and his wife went to a seance of a spiritualist to talk to their dead son, Tad. Lincoln didn't believe it so much as his wife did, but it gave people comfort. I mean, it was the idea that there's a lot of death in the 19th century, and it gave people comfort. It was a form of therapy, actually, to know that they're communicating with their dead loved ones. There's a monument in Rochester to the Fox sisters, and there's a plaque on it. You probably can't read it very well, but it says at the bottom, "There is no death, there are no dead." Another thing involved with the Erie Canal was the abolitionist movement gets spread because of it, and also the fugitive slave law gets passed in the 1850s, and people were so against they had to return runaway slaves that the canal was used to help a lot of slaves run away and escape. So there were many different routes to follow for that escape route, and he talks about it in the book. He actually mentions Elmira in the book. Fugitives frequently came from New York State and Philadelphia via Harrisburg and Williamsport. From Elmira, a focal point north of the Pennsylvania state border, one trail led to Niagara and Buffalo, a second at Mid-Lake, Ontario ports, and the third swung east of Oswego by way of Ithaca, Auburn, and Syracuse. So he talks about it in the book. And that's why we have a statue in Elmira of John Jones. I always loved his statue when I drive by. On Woodlawn Ave, John Jones pointing to St. Catharines in Canada, that he was part of the Underground Railroad, and the Erie Canal actually had a role in helping to make all that happen. In his book, he says, "The Raging Erie represents an attempt to reckon with the violence and pain that permeated the lives of poor and working class workers on and near the Erie Canal. And in doing so, it interprets that corridor from Albany to Buffalo as a realm of trauma as well as triumph, a site of alienation and powerlessness as well as achievement and national progress." So the Erie Canal did some wonderful things, but it also had a dark side to it as well. So Ferrara does not paint a completely bleak picture, though, of the canal. He does argue that out of these social problems confronting society that was forged by the canal, that these reform movements got going, like the evangelical religious movements and things, the better treatment of animals, for example. They were launched to deal with some of the problems that arose. When they got bad enough, society decided to try and take care of some of these problems. So you get things like the women's rights movement he talks about in the book. Poorhouses get established. Insane asylums. The temperance movement gets launched to try and deal with all the alcoholism. The abolitionist movement we just talked about. And even labor unions that try to get more rights for workers in these factories. Another book I think to read in conjunction with this book is this one by Peter Way, Common Labor. He talks about the workers in the building of the North American Canal. So he talks about this canal culture and the life of these canal workers and how hard it was for them. And I think Ferrara relies a lot on this book in writing his book. One thing I kind of disagree with him about in the book is he said this on page 105. Until the widespread adoption of railroads, regions of the state, such as the southern tier, our area, benefited little from the economic advantage that proximity to the canal brought to towns and cities along its route. I think he's wrong about that. I think he's overlooking the fact that there were lateral canals. And the Chemung Canal right here in Elmira to Watkins Glen was one of them, shown on the map here. And you had the Shenango Canal out of Binghamton running to Utica. You had the Genesee Valley Canal running from Olean to Rochester in western New York. These lateral canals were very important in connecting to the Erie Canal. And Elmira and this area benefited tremendously from having this link with the Chemung Canal and then to the Erie Canal through Seneca Lake in commerce. We were getting goods from all over the place. We were sending goods out. I think he's incorrect when he says this, that there were economic advantages that were gained by these lateral canals. And the southern tier was not really left out of the picture. Every major city in the state of New York was connected to a canal. And so I think I would disagree with him about this. Another thing I would criticize this book about is he relies mainly on secondary sources. He does not use many primary sources. I think he could have used more primary sources. One problem he would face is the fact that canal workers didn't exactly sit down and write in their diary every night. That wasn't something that was happening. But there were letters people wrote. There were newspapers he could have used. I thought he could have used more primary sources in writing this book. But it's still, I think it's an interesting book. I don't think, if you're a real canal enthusiast and you've read a lot about canals, you're probably not going to learn a whole lot of new stuff from this book. But it is kind of interesting reading. A lot of the stories are kind of interesting. It's not a real long book. It's easy to read. And so it might be, it's a fun book to read. You might enjoy it. So consider borrowing it, reading it sometime, or buying a copy for yourself. But it's still a lot of interesting stories in it, even though it's not exactly going to teach you a whole lot of new things about the canal, perhaps. And that brings me to the end. Anybody have any questions they want to ask? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually learned a lot of little new things, like very random new things.
Mm-hmm.
The man who founded the ASPCA,
Berg, right?
Did he actually found the organization? You mentioned him and his concern about the mules and their mistreatment, but then you showed a picture where he was in the cart that he had, the ambulance,
Right.
was in New York City.
That's where he was from, yes.
Okay, so as far as like leaving here and saying, oh, I learned that, the ASPCA was founded because of mistreatment specifically of animals in this endeavor. Is that accurate? And
Yes, I would say that's accurate. There were other people besides him, but he was kind of the leading person in it. He had been to England, and there was a anti-cruelty society in England for prevention of cruelty to animals, and that's kind of what's inspired him. So he established the American version of it over here. So, but yeah, I would say he was pretty much involved in doing that, so that's accurate.
And he resided mostly in New York City?
New York City, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, think about New York City, there were all kinds of animals running carriages and stagecoaches and canal boats in New York City, so he saw it all the time firsthand, animals being abused.
Could you also clarify one aspect of the timeline a bit for me? When you mentioned immigrants who were integral to the construction of the canal, or the digging and so on, and maintenance, you mentioned the Irish by name. It seems to me that the canal would have been largely constructed by the time there were big waves of Irish here, or is that?
Yeah, the big waves come in the 1840s, of course, with the potato famine. But, there were Irish coming over from the very beginning. There were Irish coming over at the time of colonial America or in the Revolutionary time. But the big waves, you're right, don't come until the 1840s. But there were Irish coming at that time looking for work.
So do we know much about what other groups were represented in large numbers?
There were some, I've read that there were a lot of Welsh people, also some Germans. That's where most of the immigration was coming from, was from Western Europe, not so much Southern. You weren't seeing Italians and Greeks and those people coming at that time.
Thank you.
Yep.
I loved a bunch of things.
No? Okay, good. Glad you liked it. Anybody else? Any questions?
So the immigrants who came in and worked on the canal, did they settle in the area afterwards? Is that
Quite often they did, yes. I mean, there were a lot of Irish who worked on the Schmunk Canal. So, I mean, they'd done canal work, so they heard there was a new canal being built near Elmira. They all came here and worked on this one as well. And yeah, a lot of them stayed here and settled here. Or some of them were transient. They would work on this canal, it was done, they'd go work on another canal somewhere else. They would just keep on moving. But there's some who stayed here.
What kind of housing was there for them?
That's a good question.
Or tents, or tent city?
They built shanties. They just took wood and just threw up. It basically was like a horse stall that they lived in. They threw some straw on the ground, and that's where they stayed, right along the line of the canal. Yeah.
Was there a company that organized the workers? Was there a company that provided any kind of housing, food?
Well, you had, the canal work was let out in contracts. You got a section, so you had a certain section of the canal you contracted to build. You made a bid on it for so much money. So it was up to you to go find the workers, and you had to feed them, house them, all that stuff. You know, provide water to them, all those kind of things. And so sometimes the contractors were not very reliable, as we found out on the Schmung Canal. They would bid low to get the contract and found out they couldn't do it for that much money, and the contractor would then skip out, leave the workers with no money. So then they would just leave and go somewhere else and find work. Yeah, there wasn't any real company that did it. The contractor would send out people to try to recruit workers to come work on the canal, which they did for the Erie Canal as well. But you didn't have one company in charge of it.
Was there anything, I mean, you mentioned the boys who were working there. Did child labor laws come into effect after that? Or was it much
Not
later?
until the 20th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not until the 20th century for that
Still would
happens.
contribute, I would guess,
Yeah.
to the
Yeah, it's just-
information about.
Yeah.
It's amazing how dispensable life was.
What it is, it's, I mean, like I said, life was kind of cheap, and these kids got treated terribly. You know, that's the side of the canal you don't really see when you read all these other books. They talk about how wonderful the canal was, and it built Syracuse and Utica. Didn't help these people very much. Their lives were hard.
I think it's interesting when you mentioned at the end that one of your personal observations was you wish that the author had used, or maybe looked a little deeper for original sources as opposed to secondary. Because, again, thinking about the large need for immigrant labor and whatever, my mind went to the growth of tenements in New York and what it was that, you know, how the fact that there were some Irish here that attracted members here and said, come to New York, we'll definitely find work for you and so on. There had to have been families that did the same up here.
Oh, sure, yeah.
For this kind of work.
Yeah, people used to go to New York City and recruit Irish girls to come here and be domestic workers. Sure. Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you.
And I just want to let people know that we have some papers here with the schedule. So if you haven't looked at it online, you can pick one of these up. The next book review is October 3rd, next Friday, and it's The Hidden Life of Trees, what they feel and how they communicate. And that's by Peter Wallenben, and it's reviewed by Melanie Wood. So think about next Friday also. And any help with chairs would be greatly appreciated. We just need to pick them up and stack them the best we can. So, thank you very much.